I wanted to say something before we get started. I do think it's also cool that Malia's family is here to see her get baptized. Anthony is getting baptized too. Now, what's funny is we can have a family that comes and witnesses our baptism. But when you're baptized, you're actually baptized into a family. Yes. So what's cool is, Anthony, even though you may not have any, quote, family here, your family is here. Yes. Okay? Just so you know. Just so you know. Okay. Chris's joke was so good that mine was really lame. So anyway, I wanted to tell you, as I like to teach things that happen to me as well as things that happen in the Bible. I got up this morning with a really bad attitude and I didn't want to come to church. That happens to the preacher too. And even though in my head I was excited about the message, for whatever reason, my attitude wasn't good. I get up with this bad attitude, and I'm telling myself, be quiet, do not say one negative word to your wife. And I walk into the kitchen, and she was cooking breakfast for the whole week. Now, what you may not know is I'm the cleanup person in our house. And so the dishes were piled all the way across the kitchen and piled in the sink. And I went, dang. This is ridiculous. I'm already not having a good attitude, but you know what? I didn't say one word. I spoke to God and I said, God, this is not going well. He said, I heard him say this, do you know what's good for a bad attitude? Work. So I got in there, and before that egg casserole was done, the kitchen was spotless. Hallelujah. And my attitude had come up about 50%, right? I was still having an issue though. Now I was okay with going to church, but I wasn't jovial about it. I wasn't excited about it. And so I went out in the backyard to do my little errand, or my little chores that I do every morning. Unlock this, move this over, do this. And this morning I was going to ride my bike, so I moved the Jeep back out of the way so I could get the bike out. The whole time I'm confronting my attitude. And so I go down the list and I start thanking God for all the different things in my life that He has done. Clear from having babies to them being all grown now to having grandbabies, I'm doing all of that. And when I was about halfway through with that, then I turned that and started telling God who I am. I'm a child of the King. I am favored by the Most High. I am the apple of the Creator's eye. Amen. And next thing I knew, I came in, I told Michelle, I said, I'm ready to go to church. The reason I'm telling you that is because we all go through that. We all have days like that. And so I wanted to share with you that sometimes my mornings start out like that too. But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way. I don't know if you know this, but there's only one thing in life you can truly control. Your attitude. Amen. Right? And the way I've found that is best to do that is get God involved in it. Yes. The minute I get God involved in it, He can correct it. Why? He's the one that created you. Yes. Right? He knows what you need. He knew I needed to wash the dishes, and so my lovely wife made sure there were plenty. Right? And by the way, that egg casserole was awesome. Thank you. Just so you know. I thought about it the whole time I could smell it the whole time I was washing all them dishes. Right? Anyway. Okay. So, as I told you last week, and I think I've told you every Sunday because this is a teaching time, is every Sunday this year I've talked about how I'm reading the Bible through this year. And people all the time go, well, you're the preacher, you probably read it through every month. No. I'm just like you in the sense that I have to make myself read the Bible. See, because I can come up with 100 things to do before I sit down and do that. Well, this year what I'm doing is, on my Bible app on my phone, I just go to YouVersion, click on it, and I go to NLT, click on it, and then I go to my scripture, which this week I'm finishing up Genesis. I finished Genesis actually yesterday because I do 2 chapters a day in the Old Testament, 1 chapter a day in the New. And so I pushed play, and that's the way I'm reading the Bible this year. I'm actually listening to it. Now, I think it was Tuesday, you get into the story of Joseph. Bar none, it's my favorite story in the entire Bible. Genesis chapter 37. So Tuesday, I push play and I listen to it all the way to chapter 50, which is the last chapter in Genesis. And you might say, well, since you skipped that far ahead, you probably didn't listen to it the next day. No, the next day I went to chapter 39 and I listened to it all the way to 50. Then I went to 41 the next day and listened to it all the way to 50. And I did that every day because I love the story. And that story ties directly in with what Randy said, with what Melissa said in the first service, and what Michelle said. All right? And I'll get to that in just a minute. But I wanted you to see something this morning. I'm going to do something this morning that I don't do all the time. I'm going to tell you the story of Joseph. And you might say, okay, well, that's all right. No, I want you to understand, this is the way I share Jesus with people. People ask me all the time, well, aren't you intimidated when you run into an atheist, or you deal with somebody who's in their addiction, or you deal with somebody who's really bad, a murderer, right? What do you do when you... First of all, I listen to their story, and then 90% of the time, I have a story in my life that goes alongside that, or there's a Bible story, and I tell them the Bible story. Just this week, I had somebody telling me this and that and this and that, and I said, oh my gosh, that sounds just like this story, and I went into the Bible story. You say, how do I share the gospel? The easiest way is to tell a Bible story. It's very simple, all right? So, chapter 37 starts out with the introduction of Joseph. And you say, who's Joseph? Here's the story of Joseph. Abraham was called of God to leave his country and go to a place God would show him. So Abraham followed God. God set him apart. God made a covenant with Abraham. And then Abraham in his old age had Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. God makes a covenant with Isaac, then he makes a covenant with Jacob. Later on, he names Jacob Israel. That's where we get the country of Israel. Well, one of the ways that happens is Israel, or Jacob, had 12 sons. All right? The 11th son, born to him in his old age, through his favorite wife. This is where the story takes a real twist, and I don't like this part. Number 1, you should only have one wife. Number 2, if you're married to more than one, you shouldn't have a favorite. Right? And women, if you're married to 2 men, you shouldn't have a favorite. Right? That's where everything gets sideways fast. Right? Anyway, and the reason that happened is because his father-in-law tricked him, and he was working 7 years herding sheep for this daughter that he loved, right? And then his father-in-law tricked him and gave him the daughter that was not very pretty. What? Yeah, on his wedding night, he figures out it's not the one he thought it was, right? The one that was his favorite couldn't have kids for like 30 years. All right? And then she has a child. Guess what his name was? Joseph. Now, Jacob was very fond of Joseph because it was from his favorite wife. Joseph is the 11th child out of 12. All right? Because his dad thinks he's all that in a bag of chips, right? He makes him a coat. And this coat has all kinds of colors in it. And it is so loud. Now, when I was growing up, what they'd call a coat like that in the early 60s was a zoot suit. How many ever heard of that? Right? In John Travolta's day, back in the disco era, it was the one with the big collars, right? The big bell bottom. That's basically what he had on. Something that was that loud, right? In fact, you could see him for a mile on flat land coming. All right? Now, what happened is one day, Jacob tells Joseph, I want you to go out and I want you to check on your brothers. They're out there in the pasture watching over the sheep. There's 10 of them out there. I want you to go check on them, take them some food. Well, what had happened previously, about a month earlier, Joseph started having these dreams. And then he told his brothers about them. He said all of these grains, all of these wheat stood up, and then the shepherd or the harvester of the wheat came up, and all of a sudden all this wheat bowed down to it. And they go, you're telling us we're going to bow down to you one day? You're a knucklehead, right? And then he tells his dad, I had a dream last night, and the sun and the moon bowed down to me. And his dad said, don't tell anybody that dream. Your mama and your daddy are not going to bow down to you, right? But he's having these dreams. He's told these dreams to his brothers. He's got his coat on. He's on his way to go check on them, and they can see him for a mile, and those 10 brothers start talking. You know what? I am sick and tired of this boy's dreams. I'm sick and tired of him being the favored one. In fact, let's kill him. And what happens is where they're feeding their sheep, there's a place called a cistern. And people who are old enough, they know what that is. It was a place that you kept water. There were all different kinds of cisterns, but this one was a hole in the ground. And it was dry. It did not have any water in it. And so, the whole time they're talking that they're going to kill him, Reuben, the oldest son, said, no, we don't need to kill him. We don't need to kill him. This is our dad's favorite son. It will kill our dad if we kill him. And so he said to himself, I'll wait till they throw him in the hole, and then when they're not looking, I'll get him out and I'll take him home. But what happens is they throw him in the pit, and about the time they're getting ready to kill him, they see these Ishmaelite traders coming, who are all on camels, all in a row coming, because the Ishmaelites traded in rare goods and precious things, and they would travel from city to city. Well, they were in the land of Canaan, and they were on their way to Egypt. All right? If you were to look at that on a map now, that's the southern part of Israel that makes a point, and it points straight to Egypt. That's where they were. And so what happens is they sell him into slavery to the Ishmaelite traders. And then they take his coat, they kill a goat or a sheep, and they smear the blood all over it. They take the coat home and tell their dad, a wild animal has killed your son. Sorry. And they're thinking, we're done. We're done with it, right? The dad grieves for years and years and years. It's terrible. In the meantime, Joseph is sold into slavery. The Ishmaelites take him to Egypt, and when they take him to Egypt, a guy named Potiphar buys him. Now, Potiphar is not just a regular old guy in the Bible. He's a governor in the land of Egypt. He is a high-ranking, and Egypt is kind of like a country like the United States in the sense in those days. It had states in it, and those states had governors, just like we have a governor. So our governor is a pretty big deal. He lives in a mansion right there by the Capitol, right? If he says something, people pay attention. Same thing with this guy. So he's paying attention to Joseph, and he's realizing that Joseph has this ability to manage things really well. And so he puts him in charge of all of his other slaves and all of his other people, and the household was big. It was like 40, 50 people, all right? And Joseph is in charge of that. There was only one problem. Potiphar's wife thought Joseph was cute. In fact, he was handsome. In fact, she started to lust after him. In fact, she would talk to him about sleeping with her all the time. And Joseph would say, how could I do that to my master? I could never do that. So he starts working in a position to where he's kind of in another room, and he doesn't even get around her anymore. He's trying to do things through the other servants and stuff like that. But one day she cornered him. One day she caught a hold of his shirt, and she said, I want you to sleep with me. And he said, I will not. So he runs. When he does, his shirt tears off. She has it in her hand. She now is very angry because he's turned her down for the last time. And so she cries rape. In fact, she tells everybody in the household because Potiphar isn't home. And then one day he comes home after about a week being gone, and he finds out about it. He can't believe it. He has Joseph thrown in prison. And you go, oh my gosh, listen to what's happened to this guy, right? Well, check this out. He was in prison about 2 years, and all of a sudden, Pharaoh, the Egyptian leader, throws his cupbearer and his bread maker into jail because there was something going on in the palace. And he couldn't figure out who was the problem, so he threw them both in jail. Come to find out there was a coup going on, right? And so what happens is while those two guys are in prison with Joseph, they both have a dream. And they don't know what to do with it. And they ask Joseph, hey, do you know somebody that can interpret dreams? And he says, I don't know anybody that can interpret a dream, but God can interpret a dream. And so he listened to what they said. God revealed to him the deal, and he said, here's the deal. Sorry to tell you this, bread maker, but you're going to end up impaled on a pole in about 3 days. But the cupbearer, you're going to be reestablished, and you're going to get to go right back into the king's court. Remember me when you get there. He gets there. The one ends up on a pole. The other one gets back into his position. And then what happens? He forgets all about Joseph. 3 years pass by. Total of 5 years in prison. Right? Now what's interesting is the prison manager realizes Joseph has a really good ability to manage things, and so he puts Joseph in charge of the entire prison. Okay? And he runs it for him. Well, one day, the cupbearer is called in to the court, and Pharaoh starts telling about a dream he had. In fact, he had 2 dreams. And these dreams troubled him a lot. It was scary to him. And so what he does is he tells all of his wise men, he tells all of the fortune tellers the dream, and none of them can tell him the answer. And all of a sudden the cupbearer goes, oh my gosh, there's this Hebrew guy in jail where I was in prison. He told me my dream. He also told me the dream of the bread maker, and everything he said was going to happen, happened. And Pharaoh says, I want that guy in my courtroom today. Joseph is sent for. Joseph comes to the courtroom, and Pharaoh says, I want you to tell me about my dream. My fortune tellers couldn't. My wise men couldn't. I want you to tell me about my dream. So he tells him the dream. 7 really good cows. Look healthy, do everything right, great looking cows, 7 of them. And then all of a sudden 7 nasty looking, rank looking cows show up, and those cows eat the healthy ones. And then 7 bushels of grain. The grain is growing, the wheat's growing. And then there's this raunchy looking grain growing, the wheat growing. 7 bushels of it, and the 7 raunchy ones eat the 7 healthy ones. Joseph says, I can't tell you the dream, but God can tell the dream. He prayed, and God says, this is the answer to the dream. You're going to have 7 years, I keep holding up 5, 7 years of plentiful harvest, and then 7 years of famine. I'm warning you ahead of time. Pharaoh says, well, what should we do? And Joseph says, you need to hire a very wise person to manage your flock or your fields so that you can survive those 7 years. And Pharaoh says, well, none of these guys could answer the dreams. None of these other guys over here could help me out with this at all. If you're wise enough to tell me the dream, then you're wise enough to do it. So he takes him out of prison after 5 years, puts his signet ring on his hand, and says, you're second in charge. I'm the only person you bow down to. Everybody else bows down to you. Think about that for a minute. All right? Joseph says, okay, Immediately, Joseph builds these humongous barns, right? And for 7 years, everybody would bring a fifth of their wheat into those, wheat and barley, into those barns. And they filled them to the point that they were so full, he actually had to dump it on the ground. And at one point, during the 7th year, he said, just forget it. We couldn't keep it all if we had to, but these barns are full. So then we go into that first year of famine. Not any real big deal. We've seen them before. Sometimes a drought happens, and it's 2 years. It's hard, but it's no big deal. About 2 years in, people start coming to buy because they had saved up some of their own stuff, right? They start coming to buy, and they're buying stuff. And 3rd year in, they're buying more. By the 3rd year in, Jacob and those other 10 brothers, in fact, by now another one's been born. In fact, it's Rachel's other son, Benjamin, which now has become Jacob's favorite son because he thinks Joseph is dead, right? Those 10 sons come to buy grain. Jacob sends them, says, we're going to starve to death if you don't go buy grain. I've heard that they've got all this food we need over in Egypt. So they go over to Egypt and they buy this food. Joseph is standing there in his royal chair watching as these guys come in the room. And as he does, he goes, oh my gosh, those are my brothers. Now this is where the story gets kind of tricky. Because you would think, why wouldn't they understand that that's their brother? Because he looked like an Egyptian. And you go, what does that mean? His head was shaved. He wore a royal deal. He wore linens, usually white. He had a big belt on. He was smooth-faced. The Hebrews, I always say they look like bikers, right? Big bushy hair. Got grasshoppers in their beard, right? They were just woolly-looking guys. They'd grow a beard up to their eyeballs. That's the way they looked, right? And so they didn't recognize him, but he could recognize them, right? But he doesn't say anything. They come in, they buy grain, they leave. One of them, on their way out of, they get all the way out of Egypt, they're almost home, and one of them pulls his bag off of his donkey, and there in the top of his bag is all the money that they were supposed to give for the food. And they went, oh dang, they're going to think we stole this. And so they go all the way home, they finish out going home, and they tell their dad, Dad, we bought the grain and it was all good, but we got home and we realized in all of our bags was the money we were supposed to get. Now, who do you think put the money there? Joseph. Joseph made sure they got their money back. Why? He loved them, regardless of what they did to him, right? Now, about 2 years later, they have to go back because they're out of food. In fact, they had sheep and goats plentiful. By the 4th or 5th year of this famine, all their sheep and goats are dead. Right? Because there is no grass to eat. There is nothing to eat. In fact, Jacob says, you have to go back and get his grain or we're all going to starve to death. And so he sends them back. They go this time, and they walk in the courtroom, and Joseph starts accusing them. You stole this, you did that. No, listen, our money was in the top of the bag. In fact, we not only brought you the money to buy new food, we brought you the money that was here before. We're sorry, we didn't steal anything. We just found it in the bags. We didn't do anything. And Joseph kept accusing them. Still then, they didn't know who he was, right? Well, what was fascinating was, to make a long story short, he basically says, you said you have another brother, right? And they said, yeah. He says, I'm going to keep one of you guys here until you go get that other brother. And they go, no, you can't do that. It'll kill our father. He's already lost one son that was his favorite, and now he has another one. If we bring him, he will die. We bring that son, he will die. And he said, bring him or none of you gets to go. Now what was crazy is, and this is just a little segue in here, the son that he kept, name was Judah. See, Judah is the tribe that Jesus comes from. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Judah stays in the place of the other brothers until Benjamin gets there. In other words, he's a ransom. He's being ransomed. When Jesus dies for us on the cross, he's the ransom for us. Isn't that cool? So check this out. So he keeps Judah. They go back home, and they take almost a year trying to convince their daddy to bring Benjamin. And finally the dad goes, what difference does it make? We're all going to starve to death anyway. Take him. And he basically went into mourning because he thought he would never see Benjamin again. The minute that Benjamin comes in and Joseph sees Benjamin, he sends all of the other Egyptian servants out. And it said that he started crying really hard to the point that they could hear him in the outer courtroom. And he revealed that he was their brother. And then they all fell on each other's necks. That's a way of saying in the Bible that they all hugged one another. And they wept, and he forgave them. And then he said, go get my father. And so they went home, they got the father, and came back. And then the father got to see that this son had never been killed. In fact, this son redeemed the whole known world. When you really get to looking at this story, you don't realize it at the time, but 90% of humanity lived in this area. And what happened is Joseph, who was a prisoner for 5 years, sold into slavery, the whole 9 yards, ends up rescuing the whole world. Now, I'm going to read you the very last. Then Jacob finally dies. Now listen to this. Chapter 50, verse 14. After burying Jacob, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had accompanied him to his father's burial. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to... where did it go? He instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of the God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. When Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. See, he had already forgiven them. But see, now that their daddy was gone, because that's Joseph was his favorite son, they figured he would retaliate, even though he had already forgiven him. See how we can even think that way, right? Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. In other words, just make us your slaves. You don't have to punish us. Look at what Joseph says. And this right here is actually the sermon. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? Now I want to put that in perspective. Pharaoh, during this time, this is just before the first pyramid is built in this dynasty. Pharaoh had declared himself God. Joseph, being his second in charge, if he had turned his back on God, could have declared himself also a God, because he had the king's signet ring. But what does he say? Am I God that I can punish you? Watch this. Then you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. Did God know what was happening to Joseph all those years? Absolutely. Did he allow it to happen? Absolutely. But what did it come to? All of this happened to Joseph so that he could save the known world. We have no idea when we're going through hard things what God is actually doing. we have such a tendency to go, God, rescue me, rescue me, rescue me. Yes. When maybe He's teaching you something that you're going to use in the future to actually help a lot of people around you. Amen. Do you know one of the reasons I can be your pastor is because I've been a drug addict. I've been divorced. I have made horrible wrong choices. I have been punished multiple times in my life for things I did not do. I used to say, I got mad at my dad one time for whooping me with a belt. He did it a lot, and I deserved all of them. But one time, I got a whooping that I didn't deserve, and I got mad at him. He said, why are you so mad at me today? I said, because you whooped me and I didn't do it. He said, how many times have I whooped you that you didn't do it? I said, once. Did you hear that? Once. He said, well, how many times did you get away with stuff? I said, that's irrelevant. But I got mad at him over the one time that I got a whooping that I didn't deserve. Does it look like Joseph should be mad at God? With all that happened to Joseph, should he be mad at God? On some levels he should. But because Joseph wasn't mad at God, kept his eyes on God, he gave God glory when he could have took it on himself. He could have taken the glory for this, but he did not. So I want you to be thinking about that. You had a question, young man. What was it? Say again? There you go. He said God probably helped him through it. Now, I love it when kids get involved in stuff because they see things a lot of times more clearly than we adults do. That was very good. In fact, if Joseph is constantly giving God the glory, he knows God is in charge, right? So here we go. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. Now, what's crazy is, that's when Joseph is about 40 years old. He lived to be 110. So he took care of them for 70 more years. He took care of them. Did you hear that? 70. What is that? The number of completion. 7 is the number of completion. Do you know how many people they brought from Canaan to Egypt? 70. The number of completion. See, God is all over this story. God is in this story. He's outside of this story. He's in Joseph. He's outside of Joseph. And guys, when we're going through hard things, rather than getting mad at God, why don't we start asking Him what's going on? Now, here's the crazy part. I still ask God all the time, okay, what's the reason for my cancer? And He said to bring me glory and to teach the church how to persevere through things that are hard. What is that? That's teaching us things that we will use in the future. See, things are only going to get harder in America. When you study any cultural civilization, they only last 300 to 400 years the way they are. Usually within 200 years, something dramatically changes. Change is coming. I'm not sure I'm going to like it, but I've got to prepare for it. And the way I'm going to prepare for it is not financially. A lot of people go, well, yeah, you should prepare financially. Yes, you should. But do you know what? If catastrophe ever happened in America, is money worth anything? Is gold worth anything? It may. How many of you watched Waterworld years ago? What was the currency? Dirt. It was dirt. So you never know what the currency's going to be. So what's the only thing you can really control? Your attitude and your relationship with God. He's the one who knows everything that's going to happen. He's the one we've got to be relying on in every situation. He's the only one that knows what it looks like in the end. He's the only one that knows the number of your days, right? We need to rely on Him. I want you to be thinking about these things as you go throughout this week.